Welcome to the KIPS Podcast. My name is Tyler Valencia. I'm the president of KIPS and Time to Train Fitness. I have a topic, a guest that I'm pretty excited for. A little background for myself before we jump into talking with the guest, talking about what we have today. That my family, a large part of my family is or was in the military. That's not really something that's really out there that I talk about, but a large part of my family. I grew up in a military family, been on bases, many bases. I was actually born on a military base. And so to have a guest come on, we're going to talk about things that probably people in the fitness, wellness, health industry have not really thought about when it comes to military personnel. We're going to talk about training. We're going to be talking about PTSD. We're going to be talking about trauma, things that I'm very fascinated to hear about our guest, Angie Nyx, talk about, share with. So first of all, Angie, thank you for coming on the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to get this information out there. I think it's going to be life-changing for a lot of people who are maybe struggling with trauma or who have survived trauma or had traumatic past. So very excited.
Yeah. I think that being able to talk about these items is going to be a big step. And hopefully for individuals like myself, you that have worked in a fitness capacity, whether it's online or live, working with clients, this will be eye-opening and maybe potentially open up that avenue to say, hey, military personnel, it'd be great to hear your story, talk with you, and maybe see if I can help you in some type of capacity. But before we get there, I kind of want to set the stage. Do this in every episode. Want to set the stage for the listeners. Can you talk about yourself? Talk about your background, how you got started in this path, and even how you got into the industry.
Absolutely. So I've been training people since 2010. So I've been personal trainer, more so working with athletes rather than your regular couch potatoes and the general population. I probably only worked with the general population for the first 3 years of my career. Mm-hmm. To preface that though, in college, I was a psych major and I minored in criminal justice. So psychology has always been something that I was greatly interested in. And all of my research papers that I did in college, I actually chose to do them on how the body affects the brain. And a lot of people kind of think about, how the brain affects the body. We know that movement is voluntary largely. But I was really fascinated with how can exercise prevent age-related cognitive decline? How can strength training activate different parts of the brain, different regions of the brain? Mm-hmm. And so all of my research paper was on that. Fast forward, I'm 20, I'm still in college. I fall in love with fitness. And that's really what kind of was the catalyst to kind of switching my focus from wanting to be a therapist and working specifically with people who had traumatic pasts, going into more of the fitness space and just realizing how rewarding, how transformative that could really be. And then, just throughout my 13 years as a trainer, you kind of start being exposed to more and more schools of thought. You end up learning about nutrition, you end up learning about, different methodologies of training. So just over the course of that 13 years, it's really evolved. And I would say for probably about the past 4 or 5 years, I've been working specifically with military personnel and specifically with people who have trouble getting results from traditional, advice on nutrition and exercise. Pretty much people that you would classify as non-responders. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that trauma is very, very, how do I say this? Trauma affects the body so much that a lot of the traditional things, exercise more, eat less, all that kind of stuff, it just doesn't have the same effect on people whose nervous systems are greatly dysregulated. Mm-hmm. So that's what I've been working on. And that's kind of where my career has evolved to, and what I've been focused on the past 4 or 5 years.
Can you go back before we start on the next topic here? Can you go back and kind of explain more that whole non-responder term? That was something that I've never heard before, and I'm sure that will be something that we'll talk about more throughout this podcast. Can you define that? Kind of talk more about that for a second?
Yeah, and I'm sure that a lot of people not a lot of people, but there is a specific, amount of population where they're working out, they're eating clean, and they're just not getting results at the rate that they should. So if you have a person who, and this could be due to a lot of things besides trauma. For example, we know there's been a big rise with breast implant illness, and understanding how different implants can mess up the metabolism and have a whole host of, negative consequences. Or we know about like metabolic diseases, and like there's even viruses that can cause obesity. And so really what I guess I'm talking about is people where, they go to a trainer, they go to a nutritionist, they're doing all the right things, and they're just not getting results. And what's really frustrating for this group of population, which is not many people, it's not the majority of people, most people, the traditional advice works, but for this subset of people in the population, it can be very frustrating because number one, the trainers usually don't believe them. They go, oh, you're lying. You're obviously not tracking your food right. You're obviously not training as hard as you think you are. And it can become so devastating for these people when they're doing everything right and they're not getting the results. And that's what I mean by a non-responder.
That's very fascinating. I feel like that's a related-ish topic, I'll say probably, that it's been discussed on the podcast, is how being able to empathize with our clients and try to understand what they're going through mentally to eventually break down barriers that are holding them back. But oftentimes we don't have any clue what they're going through. And in our heads as fitness professionals, like, why isn't it working? Like I told you to do X, Y, Z. This is what works for me. This is what works for my clients. But there are individuals out there that there's so much more to unpack with it. And I feel like that's a great way to open this podcast and really set the tone for instructors out there, whether they are working live, online, and even in different populations, not just the military personnel, but being able to understand and open our minds to trying to just think what this client in front of me or potential client is going through and being open to having those discussions with them. So next question here to kind of get the ball rolling in this area with trauma, talking about this population that we opened up with, talking with military personnel. What are some of those unique variables? When I say unique, I more mean that are something that a fitness professional, wellness coach, health coach that's working with general pop, they might not quite understand or have gone through before. What are some of these unique variables with working with clients that do have PTSD?
Okay, so that is a really big question because PTSD does, it is subjective in that not everybody's going to have the same exact symptoms. Not everybody's going to have the same manifestations of that disorder. But I will say that, a lot of research has been going into how food affects the brain, how fitness affects the brain, thank God. But basically can I just backtrack a little bit about the whole non-responder thing? Because I think that this is important and it applies to not just people in this population that we're specifically analyzing today, but all the traditional, advice of like working out, eating less, all that stuff, it really only works well and is sustainable if you're healthy to begin with. And when you have somebody who has been through a lot of trauma, I can tell you right now, their baseline of health is not healthy to begin with. And so if you have somebody that comes to you whose nervous system is dysregulated, who cannot metabolize carbohydrates in a way that like a normal body would, you're just adding fuel to the fire. You're just actually going to make them worse. You're adding more stress to a system that's already too stressed out. Exercise is a type of stress. So if you're adding stress to somebody with a stress disorder, you could see how all sorts of things get out of whack, right?
Yeah.
So the first thing, and I should preface this all by saying I am not a therapist, but I do have a background in psychology. And more importantly, I suffered from PTSD when I was younger. And I have found all these different ways over the course of my healing journey to heal myself and to become healthy and as fit as possible. So I also have a firsthand experience of what I'm talking about. This isn't just me, out here being like the science only. Like I also have experienced this, but there's a lot of variables that go into trauma. And maybe we should just define trauma because a lot of people are very unclear on what that is.
Yeah.
If you don't mind.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So trauma is essentially any threat or perceived threat or dangerous situation that we feel we cannot escape from. Okay. So there's there's a difference between being exposed to danger and knowing that you have a way out, rather than experiencing a dangerous situation and feeling like you are trapped or perceiving that you are trapped. That's when everything goes haywire. In nature, when a bear comes and chases you, you're going to run away. But if you're in a war zone, number one, it might not matter where you run away to, or, there's no escape from this dangerous situation. And so as our body and our brain is trying to figure out, like, how do I survive? How do I survive? We end up coming with all these really interesting coping mechanisms that end up having these very negative long-term consequences. So that's what really makes an event traumatic. And this doesn't just have to do with physical trauma. This could be emotional trauma, especially when you look at, the way that child developmental psychology, looks at how the brain, actually develops in different stages of life. We have this is just such a big topic. I feel like I'm getting flustered because there's so many pieces to that question, and I probably should have just asked you to be more specific.
No, all good.
But it can also be emotional trauma, right? If you're a little baby and your survival is reliant on your parent figure, and that parent figure just so happens to be the person that is causing you the most distress, you're in quite a dilemma. So your brain has to really figure out, how can I get my needs met from this dangerous source? Right? And so there's this lasting imprint on the nervous system. There's this lasting imprint on how that child's brain is going to develop. It can be emotional neglect. It could be physical abuse. It could be sexual abuse, not just, wartime abuse, because I do think that some people still think that only, people, law enforcement officers and people that war fighters, I think that some people think that the PTSD is kind of only going to affect them, but really this can be anything from emotional neglect can affect it, sexual abuse can affect it, a car accident can affect it. And also witnessing someone else not escape danger can also cause you to get potentially PTSD. So you don't even have to be the first-hand experience. You can watch someone go through it. And because we have these wonderful things called mirror neurons, we can almost feel like we're going through it ourselves. So trauma is a really big topic.
Yeah, very big, very big. And I think my first thought, coming from being a fitness instructor and thinking of working in a gym capacity is, my first initial thought of like, okay, you're sitting down with a client, like, and they share these things with you. Like, how do you, like, those initial thoughts, those initial feelings that probably an instructor is going through, like, can I work with, do I have the capacity? Do I have that training to work with someone like that? Do you feel like these are things that somebody with trauma would share these things in like a first assessment or a first session with a coach?
So it's a very interesting question. Not typically, but I've been doing this for so long, I can actually kind of tell if someone is coming to me and they're still carrying a lot of that baggage. There's also physical manifestations that can give you clues to if, this person is maybe chronically stressed, I should say, like if they're swollen. Men in particular tend to have a little tire around their lower stomach and love handles. And that has to do with how the body where the body signals fat storage. Specifically in people with trauma and chronic stress, it all goes down here as opposed to like, their backside or, their arms or something else. But if you're a trainer out there and someone comes to you and they do reveal that, because a lot of trainers, we end up kind of becoming like these therapists to our clients, and our clients
100%.
Start feeling comfortable with us, right? And they want to start sharing more and more of themselves with us. I would say the first thing to do is recommend that they go see a licensed therapist. Do not think that you can just be that for that person. It requires so much training. There's a reason why people who get their PsyD are in school for 12 years, all right? There is so much training. There is so much knowledge, and there's so many techniques that you have to learn so you can adequately navigate that kind of a situation. It is very, very sensitive. So I leave the therapy for the therapist, but what I can do is modulate their training and their food to help them along that journey with their therapist. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So for example, Dr. Uma Naidu, yes, who I absolutely love. She is a Harvard, she's a nutritional psychiatrist based out of Harvard. And she's really championing this whole idea of like food and the gut and the brain. We have over 500 million neurons in our gut, in our digestive system. And that's thought to be because if you look back in our evolution, and the way that our bodies are kind of born in the womb is that the brain and the gut were actually one before they separated and then, became different systems. So we have so many neurons in our gut, and she's really championing this concept of your food helps your brain, right? Mm-hmm. And so being just a huge fan of hers and just, combing over the research and testing things with myself, testing things on my clients, that is one of those things that I can do to give them food recommendations and supplement recommendations to kind of help out with the deep work and the therapy work that they're doing. And same thing with their movement and their training. What's really interesting about people who have experienced trauma is they are very out of touch with their body and their body signals, which can be very dangerous if you're a trainer and you're prescribing like a max effort lift. If your client can't tell where max effort is, where failure is, if they can't tell if they're overdoing it, you're really putting them at risk, especially if you're not working with them in person and you're doing something like remote coaching, because you're not there to actually be like, okay, man, you cannot keep going. Mm-hmm. So the feedback from your clients with trauma isn't accurate at all, usually. They're more likely to overtrain. They're more likely to diet to the extreme. And so just having that kind of an understanding, if somebody does come to you and says, hey, just so you know, I'm working with a therapist, I have some trauma I'm working through. As a trainer, you should kind of be like, ping, like, okay, then I got to really pay attention to this person's rate of perceived exertion and this person's, when they tell me that they're hungry or not. It's likely not going to be accurate.
A quick little promo break here in this episode. If you're a fan of the KIPS podcast, you know that at some point there's a promotion for the Naboso Duo insoles. I just pulled these out of my shoes, gave them a quick rinse to get the sock dust off of them, and I wanted to talk about them because they're great. They're fantastic. They make an impact on your daily life. If you sit at a desk or if you're on your feet, sometimes your feet just feel achy, or maybe they feel like they went to sleep. That's for myself. I felt like after working a full day that my feet did not want to go to the gym, work out, do something active, and it led to some bad habits. But with these, I feel more active. I feel I can do more things, and I've been using them for over a year now. With your clients, with your family, with your friends, share them, talk about them, see what they think, because they really do make a difference. If your feet feel more active, you're going to be more active, and that equates to being more healthy. Check them out. There's a link in the description. See all the products they have, and let's get back to this episode. Fascinating. That's right there. That right there. So much to unpack right there.
Yes, I know.
First, the experience level, I'll say, of the instructor working with somebody, being able to hopefully watch the client, analyze them, and be able to say, okay, I think that was enough for today, or to be able to have that conversation, that communication with a client. I think that's one thing right there. But maybe you are a newer instructor, or maybe you are experienced. I'll say, I think this could be something that anybody can go through, being able to potentially get in that situation where you can't, or you don't know how to say that to them, or you don't know how to read your client that way, or maybe based off just that one day that they are training differently than the previous day. There's so much to unpack with just that. And do you think that any of that, I'll say the effects of not knowing where your max limit is, do you think that comes from any type of training that they might have had over the years of, I know I personally have not been in the military, but other types of sports, athletics, you're constantly being told, push as hard as you can, push to your max. And all of a sudden you get into a gym situation. And any fitness professional knows that, okay, pushing 100% to the max is not always the best thing. But yet
doesn't work.
Yeah. You're told your whole life.
Don't max out every day.
Yeah. You're being told your whole life, okay, you need to push, you need to go 100%. Oh, you're a baby if you don't, push as hard as you can. Or if you're not, super sore the next day, it's like you get into the training situation, like, that wasn't good. None of that was good. So do you think
I made you tired and sore, but not better?
Exactly.
Right.
Hmm.
No, that's an excellent point. I think that our industry does do a great deal of disservice to always promoting the grind, grind, grind mentality, and undervaluing rest and rejuvenation. I think our
Yeah.
culture as a whole, especially here in America, we value and put on a pedestal, the harder you work, the more valuable you are. And that's not necessarily true. I think that we need to start rewarding people who work smarter, not harder.
Yeah.
I think that we need to start, valuing rest and rejuvenation more than the pushing. It's all a balancing act, right?
100%.
So yeah, people with PTSD definitely are more likely to overdo it. They're more likely to have essentially it's an intensity addiction. And the reason of that is, number one, for people who have lived in high stress, chronically stressed situations, stress is familiar. And anything that isn't familiar, our brain is going to say, uh-oh, that's scary. It's dangerous, right? So we are wired to stick with what we know, even if that thing isn't good for us. But just, neurochemically as well, the brain can actually, if you are exposed to stress long enough, the brain will actually release morphine-like chemicals that so you can cope with the pain and with the intensity and with the stress of your situation. So because think about it, right? If you are constantly living in a war zone, you're not gonna be able to function if you're always freaking out. And so what ends up happening is this really interesting sort of transformation of like, we don't have any other choice. So how can we just deal with this? Well, let's give a little bit of morphine-like substances so we can get through it, right? So there's this intensity addiction that happens. And the fear of the unknown and the fear of rest, and not being able to even tell where that is, it's just a very convoluted problem.
Yeah. I want to focus now on, continue on this thread of the recovery and being able to potentially program those with clients. How do you view those? How do you work with those and integrate those into a program with a client? Are you finding yourself having to push more of a recovery stage and these types of practices with these types of clients?
Yes, absolutely. So, number one is I have to train my military personnel different than I train someone who maybe is the victim of sexual abuse from childhood. Those are two very different people. Number one, with military personnel, we cannot just avoid fitness and intensity because quite literally their lives depend on it, right?
Yeah.
Sorry, my cats are right here. So we can't just be like, we just can't avoid fitness. So, but making sure that you're monitoring their sleep. Sleep is a very, very important thing when it comes to recovery and when it comes to making sure that your clients are rested. PTSD and trauma really mess up your circadian rhythms. They really mess up your ability to sleep because your body is essentially in a state of perpetual fight or flight. And I want to talk about why that happens. But just to finish my first thought, making sure that they're sleeping. There's so many great technology, apps that we can use now, like the Whoop, and making sure the Aura Ring, like making sure that you're actually rested, that can tell us and give us that actual data. Very, very useful because, like I said, their subjective analysis of how fresh or tired they are is not going to be accurate. So for these populations, using apps like that, using tools like that is crucial.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And then, great. Right, because there you could be like, how are you feeling? And they're, number one, a lot of my tough guys are going to go, I'm fine. And I'm like, did you sleep? And they're like, not for 2 days. And I'm like, you're not fine. Right? Seriously. So, so just making sure that they have that data, and that actually helps them learn too, along with it. Right. So they could be like, oh, I'm actually not well rested. Then what I like to do is really make sure that they are paying attention to their body's signals. Okay. So if they have the data saying I'm not rested, then I have to actually show them what that feels like. They are so disconnected from their bodies. So I have to really almost do a full body scan. How does your shoulder feel? How's your mobility? How is your, actually teaching them how to perceive tightness in their joints, how to perceive, actual, are you tired? Yeah. Right? Because making that connection between what I'm experiencing and what I'm feeling in my body, that's really what gets lost on people with trauma, is they don't understand what their feelings mean, which is the whole thing.
Oh, no.
But maybe I could just go back to kind of telling people what the deal is with PTSD. And basically, it's a stress disorder. It's a stress disorder where essentially what happens is you are exposed to a very, very traumatic event, right? And that causes and remember, trauma means you don't perceive that there's a way out. Okay. So in order for you to deal with that, you can't run away. You can't call for help. So what ends up happening is your consciousness has to downregulate certain parts of your brain and just live through it. And so there's actually 3 stages of how we deal with stress. The first one is social engagement. So when we're exposed to stress, the first thing, you can even look at this, kids, what's the first thing we do? Mom, help. We cry out for help. Okay. Mm-hmm. Second thing we do, fight or flight. This is where our body prepares us to literally kick ass or run away. So there's all sorts of physiological things happen in fight or flight. Blood goes to your extremities. It goes away from your organs, including your digestive organ, which is why people with PTSD have issues with digestion, because they're kind of constantly in a state of ready to go. Increased heart rate, shallow breathing, constant muscle tension. We are ready, locked and loaded to fight or flight. If you cannot fight or flee, you're only left, the only thing you can do is freeze, right? Mm-hmm. And this comes from our reptilian brain, and you basically just have to stay put and weather the storm and wait for it to pass. And so if we think about this actually makes sense, because I know at first glance, it's why the heck would I freeze in a terrible situation? If I'm getting, and I hope this doesn't trigger anybody, but if I'm getting raped, isn't it worse to get raped? And isn't it worse if I were to try to run away and struggle, to get raped and beaten for trying to run away and struggle? Or is it easier for me to just stay put and let it pass? What's actually going to increase my rate of survival?
I don't know.
Staying put, letting it pass, right?
Yeah.
It's just same thing. If a bear has its jaw on me, at a certain point, me doing this is going to only tear into the tissue deeper, mm-hmm. right? And so I'm just have to stay put and try to mitigate the damage and weather the storm. So those are the 3 kind of states that our brains deal with when we're exposed to trauma. Now, in PTSD, we never get out of those 3 states, and people are constantly oscillating between the second state of fight or flight and freeze, depending on their external situations. So basically, you never return down to baseline of the pre-traumatic event. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And please slow me down if I'm just going way too fast.
No. I think that you're on something.
You're here. All right.
With this is all information.
I'm just trying to explain fight or flight and what we do when we're stressed, right? Yeah. So that being said, with PTSD, you're constantly stuck in fight or flight or freeze in your daily life. And it's very, very hard for the body to return down to that baseline. And what also makes it harder is we have so many studies now where what we know is people who have experienced trauma tend to superimpose trauma and be hypervigilant about danger in their environment. So when, for example, they've shown Rorschach test, right? That's an easy one that most people know about. People who experience trauma are going to look at some ink blots and say, that looks like someone's rib cage just exploded, right? Which basically means that their brain is imposing a danger, imposing something bad onto something that's really neutral. Mm-hmm. And they walk through life like this. Mm. And doesn't that sound familiar? We've all heard stories of people coming back from Afghanistan, seeing an empty suitcase on a subway and freaking out and having a whole breakdown because it reminds them of, a bomb. So their brain is constantly hyper alert, constantly hyper vigilant, looking for danger. And the other thing to remember is if you're looking for something, you're going to find it. And so this is where we can get into re-victimization and why they put themselves in dangerous situations and so on and so forth. So that's another thing that really makes it difficult to come down to baseline, to get out of that stress mode, is the fact that your brain is looking for dangers, constantly scanning. When you find it, guess what? You're up here again. So there's this constant reinforcement and the cyclical nature of PTSD where you're never allowing your body and your brain to come back to baseline. Another interesting study that was done, and I'm sorry, I'm just going to rant right now, but another interesting study that was done was they took 2 groups of kids. One group was, experienced trauma, and the other group didn't. They showed them a neutral picture. So they showed them a picture of, I think it was a dad, like a grown adult working on a car and like a little kid watching the dad working on the car. And they asked the two groups of kids, hey, tell us what you see here and make up a story about it. The non-traumatized kids said, oh, they're working on a car together and then they're going to go get ice cream. The traumatized kids looked at that same neutral picture and said, oh, that kid's going to remove the jack and crush the dad's head with the tire. Yes, that gruesome. And these kids were like 8. Okay.
It's pretty,
so
very gruesome.
If you're constantly, it's very gruesome. And I'm sorry if that's triggering for anybody, but this is quite literally a study that was done. So if you're constantly seeing everything in your environment through that lens, how can you return back to baseline? That's literally just what you're always seeing. That's literally your reality and your perception of reality. Yeah. So that's why it can get so cyclical and it's so hard to recover from, because it's constantly being reinforced. Your stress is constantly being re-triggered. Your stress is constantly being validated even, right?
Yeah.
So I hope that makes sense of the cyclical nature of PTSD.
It does. And right now I want to go back to talking more about sleep and recovery because I personally, last year I had some, I'll say they're health issues with sleep. And I basically didn't sleep. And I saw how it affected other parts of my life, training, work, all those types of things. And so really, it put me in a state of I need to figure out how to regenerate my body and get how important rest is because of even things that we talked about earlier in the podcast with being told, okay, you have to go 100% in every capacity all the time. If you don't, you're lazy, you have to overwork, all these types of things. And so, that really led to some really bad habits. And so with sleep and now adding in the elements of trauma and now being an instructor working with a client like this, I can see how gaining that data, that information is so crucial. Investing in whether technology, data, software to be able to capture that can be very useful with working with our clients. And now, have you seen that a potential client with trauma, are they usually accepting of using this type of information, providing it to a coach, to an instructor?
Yes. My clients, in my experience, now I can't speak for other people, but my experience, my clients do experience life-changing, and I don't mean to toot my own horn here, but they do experience life-changing results from the work that I do. Essentially, just kind of to give your listeners some actionable steps, the first thing that I do is I have them take what's called a Braverman test. It's a Braverman personality test, and maybe we can link that in your thing. But what this does is it shows you your neurotransmitter dominance and deficiencies with the 4 major neurotransmitters: dopamine, serotonin, GABA. And basically, what it does is it'll tell you. You go through a series of questions and you just answer it. It's true or false. It's pretty long. It's like 200 questions or something like that. And getting that data back and being able to actually look at it's very, very accurate. It's been around forever. We know that it's accurate. We know that it's awesome. So if you're experiencing that, taking that Braverman personality test and being able to actually see, wow, like I'm actually really low in something like GABA. And GABA is the relaxing one. It's the one that we need to kind of calm down and chill out. And most people that I work with are very, very deficient in GABA. Now, GABA is interesting because you can't just supplement with GABA because it doesn't cross the blood-brain barrier. So a lot of people will go out and they'll start buying GABA supplements. And I'm like, that's useless. What you have to do is actually buy the precursor to it. Something like inositol would be way more beneficial for you because then it gives your body the building blocks for it to build up GABA itself, which is always what we want, right? We don't just want to supplement with these exogenous things and then hope that it works out and then you become addicted to it. Your body never learns how to actually make it on its own. So that would be a really great resource to sort of see like how your neurotransmitters are and if you have any great big deficiencies. That also will give you a list, not just of supplements, but also recommends different foods to upregulate any deficiencies that you have in your neurotransmitters. So, and neurotransmitters are just chemicals in the brain. It's just for people in case they don't know what those are. So that's a really great resource as well. But yeah, most of my clients receive a really tremendous transformation, if I do say so myself. But that's the first thing that I do is to just data collection, right? And like, let's take a look at your brain. Let's take a look at that same test actually also can tell me how you respond to different types of training, whether you're a volume person or an intensity person or a variety person or a yogi. So that's another really useful tool. And actually, I learned this from Charles Poliquin, the god of strength conditioning. I followed his work for years and years and years. And he was actually the first person to popularize this whole idea of neurotransmitter dominance as far as like who responds to what. Because some people do respond to lower reps. Some people respond to higher reps. So when it comes to training for these populations, that's a really good thing to know too.
Yep.
So the Braverman personality test, I cannot recommend it enough to figure out, number one, what type of training you're going to respond to best. It's actually working with your brain, working with your nervous system. And then number two, being able to see those deficiencies and give food and supplement recommendations. That's a really good thing that I do. And then, like I kind of alluded to before, it's about getting people to recognize their body's signals and what they freaking mean. And I call it learning the language of the body. A lot of these people do not know that, for example, I'm randomly stressing out of my armpits. They just go, I'm stressing out of my armpits. And I'm like, what does that mean? They don't know what that means. It means you're stressed. It means you are having a full-blown stress response. And so what's very interesting is with certain people, right? Like they might emotionally and logically not feel like they're stressed, especially people with trauma. They don't feel like it. And that's just a coping mechanism because they've been dealing with this for so long. But their physiology, their body is in a stressful state. Getting them to recognize, wow, I am randomly sweating my butt off right now. Maybe I shouldn't go do a CrossFit workout today. Getting them to understand like, hey, if your stomach hurts, or if there's butterflies in your stomach, that's anxiety. Right? Like they don't understand that these emotional states cause a visceral reaction in their bodies. So getting them to learn the language of their bodies really is like such a big step and such a big part of what I do to help them navigate their life because they're just so out of touch. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
So
then what we have to do, like what you were saying, like how do we optimize sleep in these populations? Number one is getting those neurotransmitters balanced. And food is a really big part of sleep. As we know, sunlight, exposure to sunlight in certain hours is as well. Thank God Andrew Huberman is like making that so popular. I'm like so grateful because I'm like, thank God I've been saying this forever. But making sure that you have the right food in place, making sure that you are optimized your circadian rhythms, wearing the blue light blocking glasses at night, all that basic sleep hygiene stuff is very, very important. But the food element of it, the food for people with trauma is so freaking important for balancing out their neurotransmitters and for giving their brain the equipment that it needs to not be stressed. You can't sleep and be stressed. Those are two very opposing concepts. If my body thinks that I need to run away because a bomb's going off, it's not the time to just like take a nap, right? And so maybe I could go into some of the main foods that are really good for people who have experienced trauma.
Share it up.
Okay, and this helps with sleep as well, right? So blueberries. We know that blueberries are high in antioxidants and all that stuff, but they also are really great for concentration, for focus, and for building up the neurotransmitters for the different parts of the brain that need to be reactivated and put online with PTSD. Vitamin E, turmeric, ginkgo biloba, really good, and omega-3 fatty acids. Those are all really, really good things to include in your diet as often as possible to help give your body those building blocks so it can start to balance out chemically, okay? Things to avoid as far as food's concerned, trans fats, and also a high-fat diet. So keto, probably not a good idea for people with PTSD. I know, that's really interesting because a high-fat diet can actually shrink down the hippocampus. And the hippocampus is responsible for how you process stress, memory, all sorts of things with PTSD. So we really want to make sure that hippocampus is like nice and full and lovely. High sugar. We know sugar is like bad, like white sugar and everything, but it really does exacerbate those stress responses. So for people with PTSD, we want to avoid those trans fats. We want to avoid a high fat diet. It doesn't mean you avoid healthy fats. It just means that keto might not be for you at this time, right? Lowering those inflammatory foods is always going to be, paramount. So we work on the diet. We get the diet down. The sleep tends to start balancing out. We do the sleep hygiene stuff. We give your brain the fuel and the building blocks that it needs to be balanced. And then we start learning the language of our body so we can actually make the proper choices, right? So those are kind of like the three things that I really like to focus on. And then we could go into things that are more what's called top-down approaches. So we have bottom-up approaches, which is where we manipulate the body and the physiology to help the mind. And then we have top-down approaches, which is where we use the mental stuff to help the body. So top-down approaches would be something like meditation, talk therapy, stuff where you can really start changing your mindset, self-love work, all those types of things. But what I like to do, of course, being a trainer and being a body person, is more of the bottom-up stuff. You go to therapists for your top-down stuff. Another weird thing about talk therapy and PTSD and why it's not the most effective thing is, and again, please pardon me if I'm ranting.
Okay.
I just get so excited about this. There's just so many things to talk about. But this is a really frustrating thing that I have noticed. So when your brain experiences trauma, essentially what happens is the entire left hemisphere deactivates and diminishes in activity. The right hemisphere is highly active. So if we think about like the left brain, logical, sequential, analytical, and we think about the right brain, which is creative and emotional, right? When we experience trauma, all that logic goes out the window. And we are just in a mode of, get away, rah, right? So what's frustrating about that is a lot of people who experience trauma have a hard time articulating what it is that they're feeling, because that's the left part of the brain. The language part of the brain, the part that says, I'm going to make sense of this event, isn't online when you're experiencing trauma. So stop expecting yourself to be able to perfectly and adequately explain what it is that you experienced. Another big issue, there's a part of the brain called Broca's area that actually deactivates. It's responsible for turning thoughts into words. Okay. So if Broca's area is not working, and we experience trauma, the first thing that the police ask you is what happened. And we're expecting these people who have literally been victimized to perfectly articulate in a perfect sequence, which remember, left brain is your sequential analytical side. They want a story. They want to know what happened beginning to end. And if you can't tell me it didn't happen, there's not enough evidence, you don't know what you're talking about, it gets thrown out. When in reality, people who experience trauma physically cannot do that. That part of the brain is not responsible. It isn't working, It's just not working. So for our criminal justice system to expect someone to go up and be able to perfectly describe this event that happened, it's a huge disservice and a huge problem that we have with our justice system. But I'm not going to go into that anymore. But you could see, and it's very hard for people who've experienced trauma to deal with their trauma if they can't make sense of it.
Yeah.
And how much can I trust myself if I don't even know what happened? And this is where we could get re-victimized by gaslighters, because we already don't trust ourselves. We already don't have a clear picture of what's going on. So we can get re-victimized more easily. We get manipulated more easily. We start looking for external sources of validation to tell us what happened to us, right? And you can see where that's, if you're growing up in a home of trauma, that could be very, very dangerous, right?
Oh, yeah.
So, it's a whole thing. It's a whole thing. But basically, the left brain deactivates, and don't expect yourself to be able to recall and make sense of the traumatic event before healing. I noticed that a lot, especially with the female clients that I've had who have opened up about this stuff, is they're like, I can't really remember. I can't tell if was I a participant, or was it something that happened to me? Like, I don't know what happened from start to finish. I'm just going to tell your audience, if they've experienced trauma, don't wait for it to make sense before you start your healing journey, because it's likely never going to make sense. Because that part of your brain, when you were experiencing it, was completely turned off. So that's just another kind of a layer of it all. But I'm sure you have questions. Go ahead.
I do. I have questions about the communication. I feel like that is something, I think before, when we started this conversation, I was talking about the communication factor, that these are tough conversations to potentially have with a client or new client. You're trying to potentially sign them up, sell them a package, but now a whole conversation unfolds where, okay, you want to ask more questions, you want to understand, you want to go down this path and try to help them, but maybe you don't know if it's okay to. Maybe you don't know if you can ask those questions, or if it's okay if they do share any of these types of conversations. What kind of advice can you share for an instructor in that position? Someone in a fitness capacity that they have this client that's experienced trauma and they don't know how they should proceed or if they should.
Yeah, that's a really good remark of if you even should proceed, because sometimes that deep mental work with a therapist has to happen before we even add on this whole lifestyle change, right? Because fitness really is a lifestyle change. You're going to have to eat right. You're going to have to sleep different. You're going to have to work out, make time for it. If that is something that you're like, okay, this person clearly is already stressed to the max. They clearly don't have any room for change and really being able to implement the things that I'm telling them right now. Sometimes I will say, I think you need to go see a therapist for a while and let's maybe revisit in a month or two, because you're absolutely right. Sometimes people just aren't ready to have that extra huge layer, right? So leave the therapy work to the therapist is what I'm going to say. But the way that I approach it too is, hey, I've noticed some things about you that I want to talk about, and you absolutely do not have to share or answer any of the following questions that I want to ask you. So that's the first thing, is giving them permission to not respond. Simply the ask of, hey, have you been through trauma, can be very triggering and re-traumatizing for someone.
Yeah.
Okay. So you do not ever want to just flat out be like, hey, have you experienced trauma? You don't ever want to just do that. You always want to give them permission and say, you absolutely don't have to answer this. You can say, I'm not comfortable answering. And I will give them that script. I'll say, you can say you're not comfortable answering, because a lot of times people don't even know how to say no to any questions.
Yeah.
I mean, just regular people struggle with not answering if they feel uncomfortable. So making sure that you set that boundary for them and you give that option for them is very, very useful. Giving them the language appropriate for if they're not comfortable. Most people, I'm pretty warm person. Most people do open up to me about what it was or what it is that they're dealing with. But like I said, never go outside of the scope of your job. Leave the therapy for the therapist, but always giving them that option to not have to answer. And then if they do want to answer, and that's another thing, make sure that if you have a series of questions, again, just keep reinforcing, you don't have to answer. I'm just here to listen. You don't have to answer if you don't want to, and to proceed very delicately if you feel comfortable. If you are a trainer and you don't feel comfortable doing any of this, don't do it.
Yeah.
Don't do it. Don't go out on a limb and just see if it works for you.
Yeah.
These are very delicate situations. You could very easily re-traumatize someone if you are not sensitive and highly attuned to who you're talking to.
Separate or similar-ish scenario here, kind of changing some of the variables here. Now, if you're a fitness instructor and the client does share, they are openly willing to share with you, and you will now are put in, I don't want to say put in a position, but they've shared this with you, and now you do want to continue working with that client. What are some of those follow-up questions that you might think would be appropriate in this scenario?
Yeah. I always like to know, is this a trauma that we're dealing with from childhood, or is this a trauma that happened recently? If it's something that just happened, I wouldn't recommend working with them right away. I would recommend that they go see a therapist and we circle back. So how the amount of time that this client has had to deal or not deal with the trauma makes a really big difference.
Yeah.
What's interesting about people who, like war fighters in particular, and PTSD, if you had a pretty stable childhood, if you made it through adolescence with a pretty good, secure attachment style with your parent figures, nothing really scary or stressful happened. You had good parents or parent figures. You ate well. You had resources. You had economic resources growing up. You had most of your needs met, and then you experience as an adult a traumatic incident. You are way better equipped to deal with trauma versus if you're someone who experienced trauma from early childhood. So the ability to bounce back, if this is something where you had a good childhood and then you went to war and shit got messed up, and then now I know, okay, this person is going to be way easier to work with. This is going to be way easier to come back down to that baseline again, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that is another question, is when did this happen?
That's
and how
good.
long for? Like, what is the severity that we're working with? How recent is this? Is this an adult trauma or childhood trauma? Very different things.
Yeah. I will say that question stemmed from when I used to work in a gym, and I was in the younger part of my career in the fitness industry, and a client had shared some traumatic information with me, and almost I didn't know how to follow it up. What should I ever bring it up? They already shared it with me. They'd gone through therapy to deal with it, and now sharing it with me as their fitness instructor. But I didn't know if it is appropriate to talk about it with them more, or to try to unpack more with them and how it could potentially affect their programming, things along that nature. And I'm sure that there are instructors out there that go through similar types of scenarios like that.
Yeah, because our clients over time really do like to open up to us, don't they?
Yeah, they do.
Which is a beautiful thing. It's a beautiful thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, no. Oh, sorry. I was just going to kind of
go ahead,
answer
please do.
that a little bit. But absolutely, like sometimes you're not, like, especially like earlier on in my career, I've always been that person that people tend to just open up to, like right out the gate, which is a lot for me, especially when I was younger and I wasn't quite equipped with the communication and the, all those tools that I need that I now have. And it was kind of like deer in the headlights, like, oh my God, what do I do with that information? So I would just say, if you don't know, say that you don't know. Don't try to be like, oh, well, I know exactly how to handle this. I got your back, girl. Be like, wow, thank you so much. Thank them, because it takes a lot of bravery for sharing. So you want to thank them. Wow, thank you so much for your bravery in sharing that with me. I will do my best to take care of you physically and nutritionally, if that's something that you offer. And I hope that you continue to heal with your therapist, right? Yeah. You can also just ask the client what they wanted from telling you that. So if there's someone who is like already, just putting that on you, right? There might be a reason, and you don't have to guess. You can ask, like, was there a certain reason that you wanted to share that with me? That's just so I know what to do with it. You can totally ask and get that feedback from them, right? Because everybody's going to have their own journey. Some people, especially in the beginning stages of healing, when they are first talking about their trauma to a therapist, they are kind of like, it's exhilarating to kind of share, and it feels like so much weight has come off of you that sometimes you just want to shout to the world, I was abused, I had trauma, blah. And it might not even be an intentional thing that they're trying to communicate with you. It just might be more of an emotional release, and they're just kind of like trying to get it off of their chest because they're still working through it. So you don't have to do anything with that, but you can always ask if you feel called to, if that makes sense. Yeah,
that was good. That was really good right there. That's something that I think many instructors, when they're in that position, they might not have that thought to say, how would you like me to use this in our session, or how would you like to proceed with that? Why did you share that with me? Because there might be something in there that opens up another conversation, and they might share more about, things that might not be well suited for your training with them, for your programming with them, and how you're going to be working with them. So I think that was really good right there. Right now, we're going to get to our podcast takeaways. And as this episode went on, I felt like it was, I'll say, necessary for me to throw a little curveball in here for you, because the typical question that I ask, I didn't think it was that appropriate. And Angie does not know that I'm going to be switching the question. So we'll see how she can do that with it. But the typical podcast question that I've been using for 2023 has been revolving around online coaching, online training. But I feel like it'd be much more appropriate and provide much more information if we kept it in the area of trauma. Angie, what are 3 myths about trauma that you could share with the listeners that somebody listening, instructor, wellness coach, health coach, that could be very useful for them to know that this is something that you might have heard, that you might have come across, and this is potentially a myth to just be aware of?
Good question. The first thing that I really want to get across is that trauma is not just a mental disorder. PTSD, I should say, is not a mental disorder. It physically affects the body in very, very physical ways. Trauma is stored in our body. Your brain is inside of your body. I think that's one thing that people kind of want to separate. They're like, there's my brain and then there's my body. And I'm like, no, like it's all one system. So if you have a stress disorder, that's going to affect all sorts of parts of your body. Depending on the individual, it's going to manifest in different ways that are maybe more genetically vulnerable because of your family history and stuff. So most important thing is, if you are dealing with PTSD, you have to take care of your body. You have to do that bottom up approach. Make sure that you're sleeping, make sure that you're eating right, make sure that you are not overdoing exercise. Try to not use substances to deal with this. So that is the most important thing, is your brain is a part of your body, and trauma isn't just up here in your head. It is quite literally everywhere. We know of people who have experienced trauma who have abdominal pain that has no physical origin. They have joint pain that has no physical origin. We have people with a lot of digestive distress happens after you do trauma because, like I said, your guts are the second brain. And so you're just understanding that the body and the mind are one integrated system would be the first like main myth that I want to get across.
Yeah.
Secondly, would be that just because you experience trauma, it doesn't mean that you're going to get PTSD. I have noticed this recently where people are sort of hyper aware of trauma nowadays. I don't know what happened, but it's like the past 5 years, it's been trauma, which I'm very grateful for. However, it also can make people sort of hyper aware and expecting that they're going to get PTSD if they experience a traumatic event. So just because you have trauma, or you're exposed to trauma, it does not mean you're going to get a full-blown stress disorder like PTSD. That's myth number 2. Let's see, myth number 3. That's going to be a hard one. I don't know. I'll have to think about a third one. Definitely those 2 irritate me.
I was going to say that there was probably another one in your first response. We're talking with sleep and when you start adding those elements. But I think there were already 3 to 5 already, which you've answered, which we'll roll with.
So much more to say.
All good with. Before we sign off here, Angie, can you share social media links, podcast information, and how people can find out more about you?
Yes. So my Instagram handle is the_real_Angie_Nyx, and that's NYX. My YouTube channel is Angie Nyx, and my podcast is going to be the Angie Nyx Podcast. I did have a podcast previously. We only got a couple episodes. It was with my co-host who's in the military. It's called the Next Step Podcast. But that is now going to be going under the Angie Nyx Podcast. So don't get confused if you click on the Angie Nyx and the first episode is the Next Step Podcast. And we are going to be starting to be pumping out information like this and many more things once a week.
Great. And I'll have that information in the description for our listeners. Angie, thank you for coming on the KIPS podcast, sharing this information. I thought so many things that instructors, no matter where you are in the health, fitness, wellness industry, you could utilize and hopefully understand more so that when you do work with your clients and moving forward, they can utilize that information. So again, thank you, Angie.
You're welcome. Thank you so much.